Wonderful to see all of you here, and I hope you came consciously for this session and you're not people who got left behind because of Myra Khan or who are here anticipating Orhan Pamuk. Even if that's the case, you are still very welcome. We promise to hopefully entertain. So my name is Osama Siddique, and this is a session with a twofold purpose to it. And I think it's a purpose very close to my heart because it is here to promote a local indigenous publication, the Aleph Review, which has been coming out for 4 years. And the most recent issue has just come out. And you will hear me saying it several times today. It's available outside, limited edition. You must get it. This is a very attractive, and I will use that word, literary magazine, because it combines the visual with the verbal in a very creative manner. In addition, I think it's very promising because not only does it carry pieces by luminaries, but it also provides opportunity to lots of younger writers. And shorter fiction is something very difficult to publish as is. So the fact that there is a Pakistani magazine which has dedicated itself and spends an entire year envisioning and coming up with a publication is really praiseworthy. So we are partially going to showcase the magazine itself and talk about the process and what it involves. And I think it will also be of interest to younger writers who may want to contribute. But even otherwise, people who are fond of literature and who want to stay abreast of what's happening on the literary scene. But I think there's also a larger, interesting conversation which is possible here about literary aesthetics, since we're looking at the verbal as well as the visual. And we have a very eclectic group of people who can help contribute, actually make it a very interesting conversation. Immediately on my left is Mehvash Amin, who's a poetess, who's written poetry for a long time, and who also is the main force, along with her other colleagues, behind the Aleph Review. And we'll ask her a bit about the journey and what it entails and what the magazine is all about. We have Tapu Javeri, who's a very prominent photographer, and he has contributed to this, but he's otherwise somebody known for his visual brilliance. We have Muneeza Shamsie Sahiba, who's a very eminent literary critic, has been commenting on Pakistani literature for a long time and has a very insightful perspective about this. And we have Mr. Quddus Mirza, who's an eminent artist, chairs the Fine Arts Department at the National College of Arts, is a literary critic. So we have people who are artists, photographers, literary critics, and writers who will be talking about this. And hopefully we'll also have an opportunity to have an engagement with you. But I think starting off, we have some structure to the conversation, and then we want it to be more free-flowing. I'm going to ask Mehvash about the Aleph Review itself, which is a year's labor. What inspires you to undertake such an arduous journey?
Well, I think a lot of things that we do in life are maybe triggered by something in our childhood. And as far as I'm concerned, I've always written, and I've written poetry as well as other genres. But along the way, one very important aspect of my journey was mentorship from somebody like Tawfiq Rafat and Kaleem Umar, who are very well-known English poets. And, you know, and as one went along, that mentorship was really very, very, very significant. And please remember that when I was growing up, there wasn't the internet, and you know, you couldn't just send your poems online, and it was a different scene. So, I kept on writing, and then sometimes one works in the suburbs of one's real interest. So I also edited various magazines like Libas International and Hello Pakistan. My kids were growing up, and it was, you know, I wanted to keep myself busy doing something. So as I wrote, I also did that. And then this idea came up, actually. I was invited to ICPWE, which is the International Center for Pakistani Writing in English, by Mr. Athar Tahir, and he asked me to help him with archiving the works of Pakistani writers. And in that whole process, we just talked about starting a journal. And he was also initially part of it, and then he just kind of, along the way, we had many meetings. My now associate editor, Ilona, was part of those meetings. Hira Naguib was, Momna Mela, Amina Malik Hassan. A lot of people were part of those meetings. But then Then I broke my leg. And again, you know, sometimes what we are is shaped by by what we are as children, but also by circumstance. So I broke my leg and I was laid up with a cast for about 6 weeks. And I decided I'm going to push ahead with this venture. And, Athar Tahir Saab became a bit involved with his own work. So I just decided to go ahead with it. And what I wanted to do was, I wanted to have established authors within the covers of this book, which is taken out once a year, but also encourage young people who do, like, again, thinking back to my childhood, who do not have perhaps, I mean, maybe they're not novelists, maybe they're just poets, or they write essays, or they do graphic poetry, or they do any kind of. So the idea was to give a venue for any kind of creative writing, and that includes science fiction, horror fiction. We've had obituaries here, we've had, and also to archive the work of the more established ones and get fresh work from those more established writers. So this has been the aim of this journal.
I'm glad you mentioned all those names. It strikes me that 2 decades ago, when I was a student at Government College, one of the most resounding experiences I had there was association with the traditional magazine, the Ravi. And we were celebrating the 125th anniversary of Government College, and it was a very poignant moment because for a lot of us younger people, it was an opportunity to look back and make connections. And we got all kinds of amazing contributions, an unpublished poem by Faiz Sahib, a letter by Abdus Salam, and the more you look back, you realize that the kind of luminaries. Athar Tahir, Waqas Khaja, Kaleem Umar, Tawfiq Rafat Saab, these were all the names we got introduced to. But you're absolutely right that there was, in some ways, a lot of space for shorter fiction and other kinds of things. Maybe there were more literary magazines, and aapse main ye Muneeza पूछूंगा भी इसके बारे में. If I look at this magazine, it's very interesting. You have this dialogue which involves Shazia Sikandar, you have poetry, archives, and then you've bifurcated the fiction into surrealism and fabulism, and then you look at realism, and then you have essays and interviews. This is not a book which you read end to end, over 3 days. This is a book which you savor over an extended period of time, and you keep going back to it, because there are multiple contributors and moods to it. It strikes me that the space has opened for the Pakistani novel quite a bit in the last 10 years, and especially courtesy Indian publishers, and there are multiple writers now. But the space for shorter fiction has diminished, and perhaps I can ask Muneeza Shamsie here about the context of this all, in the sense of, what's happened to digests, what's the use and value of digests and magazines, and how does that, the paucity of it, the seeming paucity of it, how does that reflect on the significance of this particular magazine?
Well, the importance of literary magazines, of course, is that they generate dialogue and they give a context. I'd just like to digress slightly, just talking about Aleph. One of the things that has been happening in Pakistani English literature, because English language writing is all connected to publishing in the diaspora and all over the world, you've also got writers who are of Pakistani origin, who are counted as Pakistanis, but who are not known in Pakistan. And we constantly have this discourse of this being an elitist language. Well, frankly, if you're in the diaspora and you belong to a marginalized minority, you're not elitist. And furthermore, in Britain, particularly, you've got a working class literature coming up. And this magazine has given space to writers like Tariq Latif, who's not known here, to John Siddique, who's not known here. Tariq Latif writes about growing up in a village in the Punjab, or of working class lives in Britain. John Siddique also does the same, and one of his wonderful poems, Variola, is of his family at partition walking across to the Punjab. So the importance of a magazine like this is it brings together Pakistani writers from all over the world. It gives a voice to young writers. So many young writers have no outlet. if you're young, where do you go? I mean, if you try and write in the diaspora, it's so complicated to get yourself published in a magazine in the diaspora. They have a kind of particular perspective. And beyond that, of course, you need a critical discourse around the work that is produced. It's not, it's not that if you write something you don't like someone to pull it apart. Once you've written it, it's gone out to the public. They might read things into it that you may not have thought of. I quoted earlier when I was talking to my colleagues, the well-known critic George Steiner, who passed away recently. I heard him say that a writer just writes a book. We, as critics, build an architecture around it. And of course, sometimes that architecture changes, the discourse changes. But it gives that book a new life, it gives it a new dimension, and critics can often link it to other works from writings from other countries. And the importance of a journal is that it does that, it gives you that platform. And sadly, we do not have journals that have lasted very long. And Aleph has really filled in a big, big gap.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to loop back to you before I move on to you. I just want to loop back to you. So given the context and given that we've had a historical tradition of these magazines, by the time you started it, and there have been 4 issues, and as I've been saying, there's a lot of work because it's not just printing short stories, you're also focusing on the, on the visual side of it, which is fairly dramatic. How does the environment, the paucity sort of affect you? Does it make the job even more difficult? What were some of the main challenges which you encounter?
I'm wondering if this is working.
Yeah, it is. On the left.
Okay. So, yes, it is a year-round effort. I have a very good team right from the beginning. Hassan Tahir, Afshan Shafi, my own family is involved, my brother, and Sana Hassan in Islamabad. I have to mention them because it takes a village. So, so the thing is that what we do is we solicit some material, but we also encourage, we have an email on which young writers can...
That's the team over there.
Yes, that's the team, and the entire team. And of course, with help from many, many people as well. So we also have an email on which young writers can give in their material. And we go through it, and of course it has to be of a certain standard. It can't, just because we have to encourage young writers does not mean that we just accept anything just for the sake of encouraging them. And sometimes it happens that somebody sends in something, and in that year it is not acceptable. We mentor them a bit, we tell them, give them ideas for editing their work. And then they're miffed in the beginning, for sure. But the next year around, then they send their material again. And I think, and then after we have done that, after we've collected all the material, we then go looking around for the artwork. And we also change the theme. So there are themes in all of them. The first one was, the meta theme was Tawfiq Rafat. We have also published a journal which has actually just been published in one college magazine by Tawfiq Rafat Saab himself, and then republished here, so for archival purposes. But also, we then look around for art, and we again look for young artists who are on the scene. So there are different themes. This one was magic realism, for example. This was Tawfiq Rafat's work and other stuff. And this was also, I mean, it was... This is the latest one is Shazia Sikandar, front and center. This is a work by her. It's called Departure. So even this young monk, I think it kind of, in a very symbolic way, kind of reflects a departure of sorts, obviously. I mean, when you become a monk, you leave the world. It's a departure. And this one was magic realism, and this one here was photography. And that's why Tapu has is there front and center. So we collect all the art and the photography, and then we piece it together, and then it's a very long process. And it's very fulfilling, but sometimes a lot of work.
Moving on to the visual people, Tapu, let me put you in a paradoxical situation because you have contributed some really dramatic photographs to the third edition, the third volume. And I'd like you to sort of comment a bit about how that process took place. But we were having a very interesting conversation just prior to this about the desirability of depicting the verbal through the visual. Because in some ways, as we were saying, the magic of the written word is that it is open textured. It helps the reader create images, and the images can be very different depending on who the reader is. So the possibilities are multiple. When you have an image, you were saying or sort of suggesting that it can be restrictive, which is interesting coming from you because you're a visual person and in some ways you want the collaboration. At the same time, there is an entire history of illustrations. And now we've moved on even beyond illustrations, which have augmented people's appreciation of literature. When you look at Gustave Doré's prints, for instance, and look at the Purgatorio, or you look at several other works of Western classical works, that's part and parcel of the entire sort of literary experience now. So there is a paradox. There is an argument to be made whether the written word should be left alone. How do you feel about it?
Before I start, I have to first say that about this magazine giving chances to new artists. At the age of 9, I was printed by Dawn newspaper, and my life changed from then. I don't know if I would have been a photographer had that picture not been printed, but it changed my entire life. So having new talent put their images, put their writings in a magazine like this, and with other very talented artists around, it creates sort of a drive within the person which makes them want to be be of that vocation or whatever. Coming to your story about whether images are limiting, I mean, again, we sort of have come to the point where we had that discussion where we've answered ourselves, but we're sort of repeating it for you all. Earlier, Muneeza Auntie and I were discussing that had Dickens given us an image of Mrs. Havisham, would you, in your description, his description of her, visualize her in the same manner as, say, an image made by maybe even Dickens at that time? Would you see her in the same manner? So does an image added to a text limit the text or limit the imagination of the reader to the text? So as a photographer, of course, we, and also an artist, Quddus will say the same, we, unlike artists, I would say photographers, we are trained by a set of golden rules, the rule of thirds being the golden rule for all artists and for photographers. Then there are other formats called leading lines and triangles within images. Every photograph we take has a format which is ingrained in our psyche and through which we create an image. But that's not the case with writers. Writers have a free hand, and artists do everything under the sun to break those molds. Again, talking about Jackson Pollock with Quddus. And as a photographer, I think it's really easy because, I mean, it's fine you have that ingrained in your head, and you're taking a picture, you just have that split second to make your decisions as to where your frame is going.
Why do we still then have so many bad photographers, if the rule of thumb is so simple?
Because you have a split second to capture a work, and within that time, if you haven't got in your mind a set of rules which is sort of ingrained into your own personality, and you know your four corners of your image, if you don't have that in your head, you cannot take a good picture. So composition becomes everything. Nowadays, technology is so brilliant, you don't have to worry about the results of the picture. You just have to worry about the artistic content and the visual aesthetics of the picture. Okay? Which is something which is fabulous in this.
Would you care to comment on those pictures which you contributed her to the jail in?
I don't have much of a contribution. I only have a contribution to this one. I have been, for a long time, if you all get a chance to look through this, archiving the old buildings of Karachi. And I have noticed that colonial architecture it's not even looked at. So I remember going in there, taking photographs and not cleaning them up. Letting electric wires and whatever billboards were stuck around it, just taking the picture as is, but taking a really high quality photograph in which I would have to go to the other side building and take a really good, well-lit picture. Having done that, I created an archive of photographs of old part of Karachi, which is every day destroyed. But that archive, when I displayed it to our DHA crowd, they wouldn't believe that this was Karachi.
Really?
Okay,
No,
and
I
I know
couldn't
the
believe
same
that.
of Lahore because I'm still working on my Lahore book. So I have that same thing. There's such a sort of a disconnect between the old part of a city and the new part,
new
of, a
part of
city,
the city, yes.
that only a photographer really who has an eye to see things like this can see beyond the billboards and the signs.
Sure, sure. Quddus, we were talking earlier about points of convergence and listen to the phone call first. Has the phone gone off? Yes. We were talking earlier about points of convergence and divergence between the visual and the verbal. And it's a checkered journey, right? There have been some really remarkable collaborations, and you could also argue that they are following their separate paths. Tapu spoke about certain very definable rules when it comes to artistic expression, and the idea was floated that perhaps the written word is much more open-ended in terms of what you can do. We can debate that. But I think it will be wonderful to get your perspective as an artist and as an art critic about how you look at this connection between the visual and the verbal.
Before answering your question, I must make a confession. For the past 10 years or more, I've been making titles, book jackets, book covers of Urdu novels and books of short stories. A friend of mine, he has a publishing house, probably a book being published every other week or every other month. So he sends me names of the writer, titles of the book, and I never read the manuscript. Sometimes I don't know the writer, I don't know what the content is, yet I make the title, and when the book is printed, not only the publisher, but the writer himself or herself thinks, oh, this is so much appropriate to my text. And I think that gives me this kind of a solution or a problem which I always face, that being someone who's trained as a painter and someone who ended up writing on art, how you have these kind of two paths in your life, like two tracks of a train going, which are not really merging together, but they are going on parallel lines. And I realized that being an artist, it's much more free because you're using a language which is not really common, which is not really understood, which is not really kind of it can be enjoyed, it can be widely appreciated, but it's not really read. Because generally you have works which are narrative, you have works, as we were talking about Jackson Pollock, works which are just arrangements of color without really giving any recognizable image. Whereas as a writer, writing on art, you are using a language which can be accessed by everyone who can read English or Urdu for that matter. But you're writing on a form which has no visual connection, which is made, which has no verbal connection, which is made purely visual. So I think that's a kind of a challenge. And while I was doing it, and then I realized that probably there's no divide between visual and verbal. Because if we talk about the beginning of language, it was visual. It is, the script is visual. And when we look at hieroglyphic script, it is so much like emojis today. Yeah. So there are like kind of there are no signs, there are no alphabet, but they are like images, a bird or eye, whatever we send, like normally while we are using a text, we are sending a text today. So I think there have been links, and well, probably later on we can talk about it. There have been links in terms of how artists were also inspired by literary works. And instead of illustrating them, they created a parallel world. They created a parallel vision. And when I was looking at the magazine and all 4 issues, and I was so happy that usually in several magazines you have, or even in this new genre, graphic novel, you have text and you have an image which is almost like subservient to text, or you have an image and which, you have a line which kind of really completes the or serves the image. Whereas this magazine, which is in an ideal position, that images and the text are separate, created by separate people without really any connection with each other, without any interaction with each other, yet they both look so apt with each other. Probably because they're both dealing with this kind of a issue of humanity, issue of existence, issue of identity, or issue of aesthetic, which is common, and I think it kind of brings a broader view to a culture, to a society, to a whatever creative practices we are doing, that how different people reach at the same place using different paths.
Yes, true.
We used to have far more illustrated books when one was growing up. Maybe it's the production cost, maybe because a lot of people have shifted to the social media, but it seems to me almost that the reintroduction of the visual into the literary may actually attract back a lot of the readers, simply because I think it augments the experience of it. I mean, Musharraf Farooqi has launched a qissa here, of course, which is beautifully illustrated as well, and I sort of rediscovered when I looked at it how it works.
By the way, it's in our book as well.
It's in your book as well. So, so the reason I underlined that was also that that's perhaps one of the things which you're also trying to revive. This could have been a very plain vanilla literary magazine, which takes pride in the fact that it's excavating really good work. But the extra effort and the cost goes into the fact that you're reintroducing this other genre, which also is the visual. And there's so many possibilities which emerge because of that. But then there is a cost, which is the cost.
The cost.
Which is always the cost for all the writers who are involved. And when I speak to publishers, and I wonder whether there are more sort of imaginative ways to make this even more accessible. And whether going through social media is one of the things which we've thought about,
Yes.
apart from having a print version.
Well, our print version comes out once a year, and recently we've set up a website as well. And the idea is now to, we will always have this because this is a keepable. And, at this point, I really want to quote your own words at you.
Oh, God.
Yeah. I was going through an interview, and you said, it isn't a fried chicken nuggets with one kind of sauce kind of deal. Instead, it is more akin to a complex, multi-flavored dish for the discerning and best served in several courses over a long and leisurely afternoon. So those were your words. And I think that also is true for this magazine or journal, whatever you may call it, because there's so much here, so much artwork, so much writing of different types, excerpts from books. And also, I mean, so this is something to be enjoyed and savored in a way. Maybe I'm old-fashioned.
And also collected.
Also
People don't
collected.
collect
It's a
books as
keepable.
well, yeah.
So, and we have archives in it. So, but yes, we do recognize the need for having something which is, like a website. And now what we did, we started off with actually a thing of the Karachi Biennale, which we were approached by Nilofer. Tapu is the one who introduced me to Nilofer Farooq, and she came to me and she said she really liked the magazine, and could we do something about the Karachi Biennale in it? And at that point, we didn't have enough time to put it in print, and we hastily launched our website, and we did an interview of Nilofer Farooq as well as several artists. But now what we are going to do is we are going to put in work which is parallel to what we put in our book. So it is not going to be maybe the bigger pieces, the ones of the more established authors, because the established authors write so much, and yet they, it's very difficult for to get something from them for a magazine, for a journal. But young people who are perhaps in a hurry to sort of have their works published and cannot wait an entire year because they want to get it published somewhere else, or that's been a case. I mean, they say, please tell us because we want to try somewhere else. So we want to carry on doing that alongside the magazine, but this magazine will stay as a separate entity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since I'm a lawyer, let me phrase my next question very carefully. And let me say, notwithstanding whatever has been said so far, let me problematize this conversation a bit more. I mean, I think we're all on the same page here, and we've looked at the various facets of this magazine. We also have a rather abstract, larger theme we are meant to discuss in this panel, which is literary aesthetics. And let me be provocative and say, should there even be literary aesthetics? And I have my good reasons for sort of taking a position that when you impose some abstract notion of aesthetics on literature, you may be guilty of imposing a certain kind of elitism on it, or you may be confining what is supposed to be free. And there have been multiple movements in the West and the East, as we know, on art for art's sake or art for the sake of a certain message. We've had everything from communist posters to Jackson Pollock. We've had the Taraqi Pasand Tehreek here. And so I think the debate remains that is literature something which needs to have any aesthetic paradigms, or is aesthetic something which we define differently so that it's not a limiting concept? It's that eternal pursuit of truth and beauty. So I think given how eclectic this panel is, it would be really illuminating for us to hear what you think about this.
Can I just put in, when it's a book, I agree with you totally. It's by one author. You know, that book, if it's a good book, will sell, whether it's a paperback form or whether it's a hardcover, whatever it is. When you're working already in the format of a journal, in which you have the works of many, many writers, as well as artists, as well as photographers, you have to make it aesthetic in a way for it to have good production values. I mean, you know, it's the same for a movie, it's the same for when you're kind of trying to push forward a certain thing which is not just the words itself, it's more than that. I mean, you know, we have in our latest issue, we have an illustrated manga poem. I mean, it's a poem which has been illustrated by a young girl called Amna Hashmi, who has done a manga illustration of it. So there's so many other things that come in. You're not just pushing selling the words. And there's another young girl in one of our issues, I think it is this one, in which she has done alternative writing. So when she sent in that piece, it was like there was writing in the margins. Some of the fonts were big, some were small, some were... So, you know, as it is in alternative poetry and writing. And it had to be managed, to put it, well, to use that word, aesthetically. Okay. So I think wherever a journal comes in or something which resembles a magazine, you have to push the aesthetic. Okay. That's my view.
So that's a practical insight. Yeah. Any further, no particular order, whichever.
I think when we're talking about literary aesthetics, and if we compare it with technology, because when we're using certain kind of technology, previous technologies have become obsolete. We don't use VCR or cassette recorders. We have other means, and we don't know how long these means are going to last for us, and there'll be new inventions. But with the literary aesthetics, all kinds of aesthetics which are not really invented, but introduced, and by writers, by critics, or by society at large, are still valid. People are still writing novels which are like classic, literary, with straight narrative, and novels which are experimental. For instance, French new novel which was in vogue during 60s and 70s as well, where you don't see any plot, you don't see any story, and it's just a description of certain area or whatever situation it is. So I feel that the great literary aesthetic is the one which is broken, and broken by a creative person. Muneeza was talking about George Steiner, and I recalled he talked about, he was a great critic, literary critic, but he confessed, he said, criticism comes after. It doesn't come first. It is like the role of a creator who sets what is the literary aesthetic is. And in terms of, before that, we were talking about kind of a blend or the bridge between visual arts and literature. Visual art has a kind of a history of being taught through academies, through schools, through universities. And it's only very recent that you have creative writing workshops in different schools. So when you go to a university, you go to an academic situation, your rules are established, you have to follow that in order to become successful. Yet, in my college where I teach, those artists are remarkable and they have done so well, who just like went beyond our expectation. And at the moment when we are talking about, there is another talk going on in another venue over here, Waqas Khan. And Waqas Khan was a person who we thought that he's going to fail, because his aesthetic was not at par with our aesthetic, which was like kind of a academic, rigid, yet he went beyond everyone who taught him. So I think as a creative person, you create your own aesthetic, which is like kind of a, you think beyond your own times. And probably I think that's the amazing thing about it.
Okay. Would you?
Well, I actually find literary aesthetics a rather complicated term. I think it changes with the passage of time, with different generations and different medium. One of the things that interests me, and especially with the discourse on the digital age, is that we are told that children no longer read books. Well, I mean, I know there is a problem and that's an issue, but the point is reading reading a book the ultimate answer? You know, we grew up, our tradition in the old days, it was the oral narratives. And I read an article the other day because my sort of discipline or whatever is more Anglophone rather than I don't want to go into Urdu literature and put my foot into it. But there's a debate now whether the Iliad was ever written or whether Homer actually recited it. We have a volume of literature that was orally recited, later it was written down. We have a strong oral tradition in our country where people are not literate as such, yet they will recite fairs to you, they will recite ghalib to you. So there is this strong, so I think we need to go beyond we have to look at the power of the word. There are two things, the power of the word and the power of the image. And a good piece of literature, good poetry, to me is something that is strong in images. But it came to me about this image because I was banging on earlier on about Miss Havisham and Dickens and his imagery. And then afterwards, when I was sitting here, I suddenly realized that my image of Miss Havisham is actually not from the book. It's from the film. It's from a very old black and white film starring John Mills with Miss Havisham in her white gown and the cake. So there is a strong relationship between images being, words being transformed into images and its power on us and our perception. And it has, of course, the advent of films and photography, painting. It has changed the way literature is written, because now you like Dickens and Thackeray, you know, now when you read them, they're so detailed. You don't have to go into that detail now. You just have to say in a couple of words, and that'll conjure up the image that you want to say. Plus, of course, the beauty of the language and so on. And today, it is also another popular concept, as Mehvash said, is you get short stories of fiction, and they're often accompanied by photographs. The British writer that I can think of who does it a lot is Jonathan Tell. I think Virginia Woolf did it. And in our own time, in our own country, I think the first book of that is by Amir Hussain. I think it's his new work, Hermitage, where he's got photographs and he's got his short stories. And the photographs and the short stories seem to work so well with each other. And then, of course, you've got films. And each medium has its own demands of what a film needs to leave out or what a novel needs to leave out. So in a way, it expands our horizons, and you need to look at these multiple resources.
So
rather than
with
just one.
the advent of the film, I think things have become even more complicated for the consumer. My experience, for instance, in terms of, I mean, I saw, maybe that was not a good decision, the unbearable lightness of being far before I read the book. I found the film to be visually stunning. I thought Juliette Binoche was just the right person cast for it. I read the book and found it so much richer, so much more complex.
Yes, books
so
often
much,
are.
well, it's romantic, but also not romantic at all. And then I read about Milan Kundera not liking the movie at all, you know, and that creates a strange. On the other hand, you have, The English Patient, which I think was beautifully filmed and perhaps far closer to the book. So there's also the success of the execution itself. And when you have multiple variations, how many images of Count Dracula lurk in our minds? You know, depends on the number of films we have seen and the sequels which have been written. In many ways, it's an enriching experience compared to what the experience was in the 19th century. But Tapu, do you care to?
Well, I feel that this is a really different debate whether movies actually follow books and or books follow movies, because I personally feel that they do not, and that without the visual you get a way richer description. I'm a science fiction fan, so I love Frank Herbert, and when I saw the movie Dune, and I had read the books, and I was like, but this is not how it should be. Yet again, I have seen The Hobbit, and I thought they did an incredible job. So there's never, you can never come across the perfect make in a movie.
And in some ways, it's a different artistic endeavor altogether.
Yes.
Because the
No, it's a
medium is so
different
different.
medium, so you have to accept that it's a I mean, one hopes that if you see an interesting movie, you would be tempted to read the novel. You might be disappointed, but usually you're not. The novel has details that the movie cannot have. But, you know, that's...
With one exception, which is The Godfather. Because
true.
much as our judiciary likes Mario Puzo a lot, the movie is quite good.
That's true. That's true.
So, but there are those exceptions. I mean, that's a subjective view. We have some time which I want to sort of, get people involved in the conversation. There's of course, there are questions which can be about the Aleph review. I'm sure there are people interested in contributing or finding out more. You can, of course, find out everything about it by buying it outside.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, as an illustration of our picking a young author, and her name is Noor Nasreen Ibrahim. And recently, Time has mentioned her stories. And so when we do this kind of thing where we are picking up young authors who have not quite made it, and then it's validated by, say, LitHub, or as her mother told me, that, her name was mentioned in particular in a collection of stories, it's a very gratifying thing. So I would really advise anybody who thinks that they're a writer to, to just get up there and please contribute.
Sure. And then, of course, there can also be any observations or questions, hopefully not commentaries, on the larger conversation we were having about the verbal, the literary, and the visual. I can't see anyone, which is always the predicament in this hall, but I leave it to...
There, waving away.
You start with here, and then maybe in the middle, and then there.
There's one here.
I'm generally blinded by lights.
Thank God.
My name is Rubia Jalani. I'm Secretary of English Literature Society and Senior Vice President of Progressive Writers Association. Now, my question is this: you have written literary aesthetics. Now, aesthetics is a source of literature which was founded by Greek and Roman.
The question,
You can see-
please. The question.
This is question I'm
No, but
coming
we have to
to.
be short because we have to get more people. Thank you.
No, this is the question.
I'd love to have that conversation afterwards with you, but if you have a particular question. No, there was no question. Okay. The lady next to her, yeah. And then I'll come to the middle.
Hi, Osama, Sana Muni here. Hi, everyone. My question is for Ms. Muneeza Shamsie. But before that, I really want to say a few words to Tapu because I loved his photo essay in the last issue of Aleph, and I hardly can wait for your book about Lahore. So the question here is for Ms. Shamsie, and it's very simple. I've recently read Nasreen Malik's book, We Need New Stories, and the advice after, after the book is about to end, she gives is that we need new stories and we need to write them ourselves. Being a writer, it really touches me, the advice, because I really want to tell my own story as a woman and as a person of color. But the question is that, are the publishers ready to take on my stories? And what is going to take to convince them? Thank you very much.
Are publishers?
Ready to take on my stories.
That's an
On
editorial
whose
decision.
story?
No, are you talking about your own particular work?
I'm just, since this is discussing short fiction, so that's
Yes.
what I'm saying.
So, I mean, I think one of the things which we discussed is the presence of a magazine like the Aleph magazine, which is very interested in somebody like you. So you should touch
No,
base.
I can't. Yes, I can't speak on behalf of the publisher.
Yeah.
It's a rough journey, I have to tell you. You say elsewhere you have literary agents who take you and then they send it to a publisher. Over here, but you just go on sending it to a publisher, and sometimes you hear of terribly famous authors who actually collected millions of rejection notes. I mean, well, our own example, Babsi, she used to say how she used to send her stories around. They would say, oh, Pakistan is too far removed, and we've never heard of this place. This was in the 70s, and yet look, mashallah, she got her breakthrough. Somebody saw the quality of her writing, and look where she is. So it's a rough journey for most people. For some people, it might be good fortune, but most of the time
If you're a photographer, it's an impossible journey. I have like 5 books sitting there waiting for publishers to turn up, but they never do.
We have to do something together, Tapu.
Please say something encouraging.
Sorry?
Please say something encouraging.
Oh, I'm just, yeah, okay. Try hard.
No more realism.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, just a basic question. Where do I find the Aleph review?
The Aleph review?
And is there online access as well?
Well, it's available at readings at Liberty Books, in Karachi, Liberty Books. And I think I have found that the reader also has to push the store or the shop to, they're a bit lazy. I mean, readings isn't because I have a personal connection with them, but at Liberty, many times people have come back to me and complained that they've run out of the book. So if you were in Karachi, just please ask.
With Liberty, you have to ask them.
You
then
have
they'll
to
get it
ask.
for you. Yeah.
But it's there, it's everywhere.
Next question.
Actually, I'd like to add one more thing. I really think something like Aleph should go into our colleges and universities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that every single student has to buy them, but their college university should buy them, their teachers should buy them, and they should promote magazines like this because it creates an entirely new discourse and an awareness among the pupils.
Sure. Please.
Well, I have a very precise and specific question. To what extent aesthetics play a role in crime fiction and science fiction and academic writing? Thank you.
Crime fiction, science fiction, and? Academic writing. Does aesthetic have anything to do with academic writing? Well, I can answer that. Yes. There are terrible writers who are great academics and thinkers, and there are others who write like a dream. If you talk about purely the beauty of style and language and all that, of course, if you define aesthetics in a more philosophical sense, in a wider sense, that's a separate discussion. I'm talking purely about visual, about the beauty side of things. But crime fiction, science fiction, you're a science fiction person.
Yeah, but the aesthetics is everything. Of course. You need aesthetics with it depends. Again, Muneeza will tell you this. If the words on a page do not flow in the beauty they should flow in, it doesn't make a difference what they say.
Yeah. And you can have, I mean, you have, yes, please.
Seussical, you'll be writing Dr. Seuss if you don't follow at least some construction.
I wish I could write like Dr. Seuss.
I wish so.
But look at Sherlock Holmes. I'm not a big crime fiction reader, but you look at something like The American Psycho, which is a deeply disturbing book. And the question does arise that what does aesthetics have to do with something which is so deeply disturbing? Lolita, so many other books like that. But you will find that there's an internal elegance and balance and harmony to how these books have been written. So it matters a lot how you write, no matter what you write.
I think there's an innate sense of
We have to go to other people.
in any.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please.
a character in any book.
So the Aleph is putting together a lot of content in terms of visuals and textual sort of, I mean, it's great content. And I feel that in Pakistani cinema, we're still staggering. Do you think that content from this could become part of maybe some short videos or movies?
Sorry?
So you're saying basically, your observation is that Pakistani cinema still faces the challenge of good scripts, and you're saying that perhaps there's a possibility that magazines and collections like this will be contributing in future to
We've got the
scripts?
script here and we've got the visuals here. The artistic and the literary side is covered. And do you think that any one of these contributions can go towards the cinema?
Why not? I mean,
Of course, I think...
Would
I
that
think
be a consideration for you in the future? Because I feel that we're not really, our cinema's just not there.
you know, in our very first volume, we printed some screenplays, 3 of them, in fact, parts of them. And the whole point of this book is that any genre, as long as it's creative and as long as it has merit, is welcome in the pages of the book. And of course, if somebody writes a great short story and then somebody picks it up as a script for a, that's a different thing. I mean, you know, but we are open to all kinds of writing, creative writing.
any questions from, from the left side? Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Usman Tanveer Malik. I was just wondering, I've noticed that Pakistani journals, Indian journals have focused a lot on mainstream realism or mimeticism as a mode of expression. I was wondering if speculative fiction has some role or space in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, especially because we derive heavily from mythology, which is by definition part of Fantastica.
So space for what? I just missed that word.
So does the Indo-Pakistani literary space have room for speculative fiction as modes of expression?
Well, I could argue that there should be a lot more room for surrealism and magic realism, considering that's what our reality is. You just start observing the law ministry and you see Gabriel Garcia Marquez there. But
Surrealism, horror, we have everything has
so I feel deeply sympathetic towards people who do just realistic fiction, because I think you need that extra antidote and panacea and painkiller of a magic realism in order to be alive. But yeah, I mean, you would agree that and some magic realism has been written, right? I mean, but how would you categorize the Pakistani fiction which has come out so far in terms of the variety of sort of not writing just realistic fiction, but also dabbling with speculative fiction?
Well, it's got an enormous variety now. Usually people tend to only read a handful of books, but actually it covers every aspect of life. And, you know, again, everybody keeps going on about it's all about 9/11. It's not. It's about personal lives. It's about rural life. It's got a very broad, and it's diversified. We have now got romantic fiction. We've got, well, romantic fiction, chick lit, you know. We've got thrillers. We've got police thrillers. We've got medical thrillers. We've got science fiction. And it is diversifying every day. So it's a very dynamic, field of work, actually.
Muneeza, you forgot me, historical fiction.
Graphic novel.
Just getting a free sort of...
graphic writing
yes,
as well.
quite right. I'm so sorry. Yes.
And I think if we broaden the term of fiction in Pakistan, not just limiting it to fiction written in English, fiction written in Urdu and other regional languages, we have all sorts of experiments. I read recently a novel by Sayyid Kashif Raza in Urdu, and I was amazed that the kind of a structure he had, of course, by reading world literature. And I think when we're talking about world literature is about, when we are talking about magical realism, it is written in Spanish and it's been translated into English. So I think if a work has a potency, it can reach its own language as well. So there are like different possibilities.
I would second that. And talking about a more recent Urdu novel which came out, in the last 2 years called Pani Mar Raha Hai. I think it's an excellent example of the apocalyptic novel, which has very sort of distinct shades of magic realism in it. And if you look at something which has been written much earlier, but is very well regarded, like Bahau, which is a historical novel set in the Indus Valley civilization. It's purely speculative fiction, but once again, very nicely done, and multiple other examples. So I would say the space needs to be explored more, but it's not as if there are no incumbents already. More questions, please. Where is the person with the mic?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I have a question from the moderator. You said something very interesting, Draculas of the mind. Could you elaborate?
Sorry, come again?
You said something about Draculas of the mind. Could you elaborate?
No, I was not referring to my fellow professionals in black. Don't get me lynched. What I meant simply was that when you come to really admire and love a character in literature, that character is dynamic because there are multiple interpretations as time goes on. There are sequels. Anne Rice wrote an entire series inspired by the notion of the vampires. J.R.R. Martin has written a very different book also based on the vampire. So there's an entire literature around the myth, and the myth has been romanticized. It has been made a subject of pity. So I meant purely in terms of the real Count Villard the Impaler, Dracula, how one interprets the character in multiple ways. Of course, symbolically speaking, we all do have multiple Draculas of the mind, but that's a separate conversation, not to be repeated in public. So, anyone else? Mr. Orhan Pamuk is still 7 minutes away, so please ask questions. Yes, there's someone here.
We have to empty the hall for Orhan.
Yeah, 4 minutes to go. Ji.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for a very riveting conversation. My question is to all of you. As someone who is aspiring to become a writer, the first thing that I obviously want to do is perfect my craft. And in doing so, I get advice that is very ephemeral. Write what you know, write from the heart, things of that nature. But obviously, the game of getting published or going through the publishing industry, it's a much different conversation. So what sort of advice would you give to someone who's maybe produced a piece of work and wants to take it further? And second, you mentioned that you also groom writers once they've sent in your work. Could you elaborate on maybe how you go about doing that?
So what we have done a couple of times, in fact, just last year, we got a very interesting poem by a very promising young writer. And both myself and Ilona, we loved it, but we felt it was going on too much. It was just all over the place. So we gave our suggestions and we sent it back. And the writer was, as I said, a little bit miffed and did not like our comments and said, okay. But the next year around, I think he had time to sort of think and maybe digest, what was written to him. And he came up with another story, a short story, which is in this book, and which is very promising, and again, which was edited quite a bit, because this is something that that the other day, I think Musharraf, in his session, Musharraf Farooqi said that when you write something, young writers, they think, this is it, this is the voice of God. And it's not. You have to self-edit, you have to run it by other, maybe more experienced people, because only with some time, with the passage of time, perhaps people in my position or his or whatever can perhaps tell that, okay, this is going all over the place, maybe we need to cut this down, maybe we need to change it a little bit. And I think every young person does think to some extent that what I've written is absolutely wonderful. So that's what I meant by the grooming or mentoring thing as far as the Aleph review is concerned.
I would just add that, the entire publishing prospect looks very intimidating, and it's not easy, although it's becoming easier. But my 2 pences or 2 cents worth or 2 pesos worth here would be that don't worry too much about the publication yet. The writing itself is a sublime task. It's lonely, it's difficult, it can be very disconcerting, but Once you get the hang of it and you find your voice, that is reward in itself. Of course, all writers need and want readers, and one has to start worrying about it. I'm not saying you're worrying about it prematurely. Perhaps you're not. Perhaps your work is already mature. But I think a lot of young people do start worrying about the publication part too early. They should be focusing on the writing part and the observation of life part and the vast reading part, which all goes into writing. Any other comments from my guests? Or I think we should wind up so that you have a bit of one more question.
Sorry, I have a question, please. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and panelists. My question, sir, please here.
I can't see you. Where are you?
Yes.
Okay.
I observed and saw Pakistan, a lot of people have capacity and velocity to write down. And how is it possible to establish an ecosystem where each and every person in this part of land contribute for new transform in this, especially literature? I observed and saw in this remote areas in Pakistan, people have more talent and less opportunity to access like such a platforms. So how is it possible to join them in this literal societies?
Okay. Can I just wind up this? Can I respond? Yeah. So, look, there's absolutely no disagreement that this is a society of great inequity, and opportunity is not something available to everyone. And that's an ongoing struggle, an ongoing battle. And in many ways, one of the tasks of literature in our context is also to highlight that. Looking at the positive side, a festival like this, the 3 other festivals which take place in Lahore are all open to people. They did not used to exist, they exist now. And I think for people who are interested in writing, I know there are lots of obstacles depending on where you are from, but at least there is the possibility that they can come here, engage with the writers, listen to talks, and that is an empowering experience. But you're right, the struggle goes on, and yes, we are a very inequitable society, unfortunately. I would like to thank my guests for their very valuable insights. Please give them a big hand.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being such a lovely audience. Thank you.
Thank you.